how quickly do you make up that time by, having somebody do it in ColdFusion versus Java?
And I think it's actually more of a 50% faster than 10%.
Well, yeah, I tend to be really conservative on my numbers. I mean, even just 10%. That's that's an additional 4 hours a week that could be spent on development time. And if
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Brian Cain, and we're going to be talking about ColdFusion versus PHP versus Java versus .NET. It's like a super boxing kind of four-way thing, and we're asking which is your better friend as a developer. And we'll be looking at several topics there: speed of development, object orientation, how many add-ons there are, and that L word, legacy development platforms. So, and we might even talk about security of each of those four platforms. And if you don't know Brian, you've probably seen him at some of the ColdFusion conferences around. He's been in the ColdFusion world for decades, and he's been developing for 20 years, been doing ColdFusion for 16 years, and he's the dev team manager for careers division of farms.com. So welcome, Brian.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's just start off with speed of development, because that's often critical in organizations these days. How do these four languages compare? Because you've programmed in all of them, right?
Yeah, I have. As far as the speed of development, ColdFusion has always been by far the fastest and easiest one to use for me. And in fact, at the last CF Summit, one of the keynote speakers kind of threw out a buzz phrase that really stuck with me. But he talked about time of thought to launch. So it was the idea of, okay, somebody comes up with an idea. How long does it actually take for you to take that thought and turn it into an actual feature or function on your website that your customers can use? And in their case, they actually turned it around. I think their case was about 10 to 12 hours, which was actually very cool. I had a similar experience probably about 6 or 7 years ago. One of the features on our company runs job board software where employers can go post jobs and job seekers go search them. We also have a talent database, essentially, that employers can go in and search. And at the time, the database had been developed by another person who had left the company a few months before I started working with this team. And he did it in .NET using MVC framework. And it was really kind of very overly engineered for the needs of that specific application. And it never worked the way they wanted it to, and it required constant restarting of the application pool, generated just lots and lots of errors, was really slow. So at the time, I wasn't heavily working in .NET, so I wasn't interested in going back and fixing and refactoring all of the code in .NET. I knew that it would be much faster for me to be able to go in and do that in ColdFusion. So just kind of on my own initiative, I went in over a weekend and basically analyzed the functionality that was currently there, rewrote it 100% in ColdFusion, and actually improved upon a lot of the functionality that was already there, and presented it to the team that following week, and they were so happy with it, we launched it that week. So I know that the developer that had worked on that before had spent weeks working on just the development and design of that, and constant fixes and updates of trying to get the functionality to work correctly. So he spent, I don't know how much time he had spent on that, but essentially I came in, rewrote it over a weekend, made a couple of updates, and then launched it that following week. And the sales and marketing team was just ecstatic to see that we could actually, produce something for them that fast to fix what was really a chronic problem that was created by somebody that was no longer with the company. So we had no, recourse of being able to go back and say, well, you need to fix this. We still had the issue of we need to fix this, but it was a matter of figuring out, well, what's the best path forward? And for us, it turned out to be ColdFusion. And it was great being able to get that launched and turned around so quickly. And, that's just one story or one anecdote of many times where something like that has happened, where we identified a specific need, whether it be, responding to changes in SEO algorithms to make sure that we're, doing well in the search engine optimization market, or responding to customer requests. That's one of my favorites. When we respond to a customer request and turn around and launch that feature the next day. That's, nothing builds stronger customer support than being able to quickly respond to their requests, and say, oh, we hear you, we want to get that done for you, and then turning around and being able to launch it for them very quickly. So they see it, sometimes the same day or the next day, or in a very timely manner. And, that happens on a regular basis with ColdFusion, simply because of the flexibility of the framework. It makes it very easy to build a scalable but flexible architecture. Whereas, other platforms, .NET, .NET can be a very difficult platform to develop in when you want to be able to make changes. It's great if you want to reel in your developers and they can only develop in a certain way, but it doesn't allow itself to a lot of creativity or outside the box thinking. PHP is a little bit almost Wild West in that there's almost too much freedom, but not enough real necessarily, it doesn't lend itself as well to some other concepts like object-oriented design approach and things like that, simply because of the nature of the language. Obviously, it's a sufficient platform to be able to build upon, because a lot of the websites run off of it. But if you're doing custom development, for sure, ColdFusion is the best option for being able to develop exactly what you need in a very efficient and timely manner.
That is great. So we left one of those 4 languages off, which was Java. How have you seen that compare when you've done Java development?
I like Java. I know ColdFusion is really was built off of Java. It provided a lot of support for Java developers kind of coming over to use that within CFScript. But at the same time, ColdFusion then also had kind of the script-based tags. So you were getting a little bit of the kind of the best of both worlds of being able to bring both in. I think Java is still a good development platform, but it again, it seems to be a little bit more efficient, maybe in certain applications, whereas ColdFusion really seems to integrate well with all tiers of development, whether it be working with injecting script and variables and output onto the front end, using it as middleware, using it for database connectivity. It's super simple and much faster to get up and running from day one. I mean, you can easily get a ColdFusion site, basic ColdFusion site up and running in a day or two, even if it's dynamic, data driven from a database. It's so much easier to set up in Java as once you kind of know the basics of what you're doing.
Why have you seen? I mean, I think Java and .NET, they're both kind of heavyweight development platforms, and there's a lot more machinery you have to do stuff, and you have to write quite a few more lines of code, in my experience. Have you seen that, or?
Yeah. with you know, my Java experience was mostly you know, based on some work that I had done in college, and it seemed like there was just you know, you could kind of get it down to looking like it was, you know, one line of code, but you know, you were actually, you know, calling what would essentially be, you know, 6, 7, or 8 lines of code, you know, because of you know, just calling different functions the way it was working. .NET seems to have so much overhead in the types of files, and yeah, you know, you do certain things in certain files, and but you have to make sure that you know, use these specific keywords when you're setting up, you know, classes and objects and abstracts, and it gets really cumbersome. Whereas you know, ColdFusion just allows you to kind of, you know, you're not burdened by the overhead of the engineering in ColdFusion, which, you know, if you want to be able to just quickly get into development, you don't have to spend, you know, a lot of time just setting it up. You can get right into development, you know, kind of from the first line of code almost.
So I think that kind of lets us go into how friendly are each of these languages, because their Java's not too friendly to the developer in my view, because it is kind of picky, and maybe that's a good thing in some circumstances, but if you're trying to get something done, it kind of gets in the way. So how do these 4 languages compare for you on friendliness from the developer point of view?
Yeah, so you know, I think in my opinion, probably the least friendly ones, you know, are going to be almost a tie between .NET and Java. PHP is a little bit more friendly, but again, because it's also open source, and it's only friendly if you're, you know, kind of come from a technical background. And the same can be said for Java and .NET. If you're used to using, you know, if you're a designer and it's pretty easy to understand HTML, if you know HTML, you know, I've heard people complain about the tag-based development in ColdFusion, but these are like, you know, true gearhead developers who, you know, love that challenge. If you're coming from, you know, sometimes you're just kind of getting into it, but you know how to write a web page. The nice thing about the tag-based coding in ColdFusion is it's something that's familiar and easy to pick up from, you know, just the most basic idea of, you know, building code based off of logical decisions and structures. So that's you know, it lends itself to be really easy to use from, you know, very inexperienced developers. In fact, I've the 2 team leads that currently work for me, neither of them had any ColdFusion experience. One was a .NET guy, one was a Java guy. They picked up ColdFusion in a week and were working on tasks, you know, within 2 weeks. They were actually writing code and being, you know, productive to the team. So from a training standpoint, at this point, especially for ColdFusion, I don't post ColdFusion jobs. I post programming jobs. And when, you know, we're talking, we let them know what they're working in, and we'll train them how to do that. But if you've got a strong set of analytical thinking skills, and you can understand logical decisions, understand how loops work, understand how structures work, there's no reason that anybody couldn't pick up how to code in ColdFusion, you know, in a week. There's a website, Learn CF in a Week. I mean, that's no joke. You can learn CF in a week. Of course, you know, that's not to say that ColdFusion either is something that's really simple. It's when I was a kid, I had a game called Othello, and the tagline for the game was a minute to learn, a lifetime to master. And that's kind of what ColdFusion is. You can learn ColdFusion in a week, but you know, even, you know, 16 years later, obviously, Adobe's still cranking out updates and working on new features, but there's still new things that, I learn. I come up with a particular problem that needs to be solved. I go, if I don't know the immediate answer, I, do a little bit of research, and then I find, what's going to be the best way to do that in ColdFusion. I have not found a problem yet that could not be solved by ColdFusion.
Yeah, it's very flexible. It's hard to think of what kind of web development problem you couldn't solve with ColdFusion. Maybe any listeners have an idea on that, they'll let me know in a comment on the show notes or drop me an email. It's interesting there you say, how you're successful in hiring developers to work on ColdFusion, because I know in our State of the ColdFusion Union survey, that was one of the top concerns that CIOs had, that it's hard to hire good ColdFusion developers. And you're saying for you, that's not a problem because you just hire good developers and then spend a week or two training them to get up to speed in ColdFusion.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter what the language is. The language is a tool. What you need is a good programmer. You need a good thinker. So if you're a good PHP developer or a good Java developer or a good .NET developer, by default, you're a good ColdFusion developer. You just need to learn the tools. It's not a matter of you need to learn a completely new language. You just need to learn a new implementation of what it is you're currently doing. What's the function? How do I manipulate a string in ColdFusion? Well, it's going to be very similar to how you manipulate a string in any other language. You just need to figure out what's the syntax in the ColdFusion, because that's the only real big difference of going from any other language into ColdFusion is what's the syntax. Going in from ColdFusion into some of those other languages, I think is it's a little bit different because it's not just limited to the syntax. You have to do things in a very certain specific way in order to get your code to compile and work correctly. But ColdFusion is not, I just don't see ColdFusion as being as rigid as some of those other languages. It is much more friendly and easier to pick up in a very short amount of time.
Now, what would you, just to give a devil's advocate position on that, someone might be saying, well, I'm not going to spend 2 weeks training someone to program in this. I'll just hire someone who codes in Java. Why is that not a smart way to look at it?
Well, if your platform is already ColdFusion based, sure, you can do that with Java, but it's a matter of, okay, you got to go back to how much effort, how much reason to develop a task in Java. So if you look at it up front, maybe you're losing that week or two up front. But if, let's say, every task is going to take 10 to 15% longer that they work on, how quickly do you make up that time by, having somebody do it in ColdFusion versus Java?
And I think it's actually more of a 50% faster than 10%.
Well, yeah, I tend to be really conservative on my numbers. I mean, even just 10%. That's an additional 4 hours a week that could be spent on development time. And if hopefully you have a developer who's there for a couple of years at least or more, but you make up that time and gain so much more time in that first 6 months. You gain time by allowing that learning curve in that first couple of weeks for ColdFusion. And yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the development time is much, that percentage is much greater than 10%. But even if you just use a simple number like 10%, I mean, in a matter of months, you're already ahead of the curve. So it's, for me, it's just kind of a no-brainer decision.
Maybe we should run a hackathon sometime, Brian, where we get some, .NET and Java and PHP and ColdFusion developers and just give them a thing that could be done in a day.
Oh yeah, that's take like the art gallery database or whatever it is, and say, okay, we want you to write the middle and front ends on this. We want to be able to manage it. We want to be able to add, edit, delete, and then we want to be able to have a public search. And you need to tell us how long it took and how many lines of code you actually had to write to get this done. ColdFusion, that's going to be, really easy to do, and it's going to come in less lines of code, and it's going to come in with fewer files and much smaller total amount of coding time that would actually have to go into it. And I think that's actually a great idea. I kind of had that idea a while back of do a hackathon and just provide a simple database with some data in it. With say how long does it take you to develop this front end interface? You could do it as a MySQL, do a MySQL and a SQL MS SQL database, so that anybody could have access to it. It'd be pretty easy to do. So
yeah, maybe we'll do that, and maybe instead of it being a throwaway app, it could be something that some charity or nonprofit needed creating, and then it's something useful out there. So now you talked about the time to develop the app being quicker in ColdFusion compared to these other three languages. What about maintenance?
So yeah, I mean, one of the issues, just kind of the difficult things to deal with maintenance. For me, the two biggest problems I see with that is the developer who is not familiar with the system having to go in and fix something. How long is it going to take them to figure out, what the problem is or exactly where it is that it needs to be changed? In ColdFusion, generally it's pretty straightforward. You're only going to have to look in a couple of different spots. But if you're trying to figure out how to implement a change in .NET working within MVC architecture, my God, that could be a huge task to undertake. Whereas with ColdFusion, you can easily and quickly identify the source of what needs to be updated and really go in and get that changed pretty quickly. And then, on top of that, there's great testing tools available for ColdFusion. So you can, do unit testing, very quickly and easily. You can write your own sandbox pages. You can use, ColdBox for testing, and all of that just makes it easier to, quickly go in and make those updates rather than having to dig, super deep in the code to figure out, what exactly needs to be done, and is it going, what effect is it going to have in other areas. You can easily do that in ColdFusion without having a lot of those concerns. And if you do have those concerns, the testing tools that are available for ColdFusion make it really easy to integrate that, quickly. You can write your own test scripts to test those objects if you want to, or those functions, whatever they may be.
Cool. So I know the Adobe, announced CF Summit that they're committed through 2028 for support of ColdFusion, and that's a public commitment. I'm sure they'll keep supporting it beyond that. But 10 years is quite a long time in internet years. And how they get to that figure is they already have on their roadmap a release of ColdFusion 2020, and there's one ColdFusion 2022 coming after that that's already started being in development. And then they've got a 6-year till end of life on their support on any version of ColdFusion. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, that's a long public commitment from a software company, because in internet years, that's got to be at least 2 dog lifetimes in terms of internet years. I'm kind of curious what the roadmap is for .NET and Java and PHP, and I was trying to find that out before we got on the call. But I'm curious if you have any ideas of, because I know Oracle has, you know, they've changed a bit how they're supporting Java.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't think they have a, don't you, it's all commercial now, right? Oracle Java.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I don't really know too much about the, you know, the timelines or the life expectancies of some of those. You know, there's especially .NET and PHP. They're big, they're big dogs in the world of the web internet development. I think honestly, I think the only reason PHP is so big is because of things like WordPress. You know, WordPress runs on PHP. And so it's not necessarily that PHP is big, it's that WordPress is big. And WordPress is, you know, you can add all of those add-ons into WordPress, but all that's done in PHP. But a lot of those people that are running those websites, they're not PHP developers. They go in and just use the content management system. And I think that that's something that kind of gets left off as in, you know, what's actively being developed. And if you took out, you know, who's working in WordPress and didn't include them as, you know, PHP development per se, because a content management system can just build off of anything. Same thing with DNN. There's a lot of DNN sites out there, but is that truly, you know, .NET development, or is that development that's being done specifically within a content management system? And you know, maybe that's part of the reason why ColdFusion didn't burst onto the scene as much as, you know, or make as much of a impact in the market as .NET and PHP did, because of, you know, there are some Java based or ColdFusion based you know, CMSs out there, but that's not, you don't think of ColdFusion as the platform upon which a content management system is built. But I think any developer who would use ColdFusion for a project would agree that ColdFusion is great for development, for a developer. But if you're just somebody who's putting up a website, yeah, use a content management system, because you don't necessarily need to know the programming. And I think that's probably a strong contributing factor as to why ColdFusion is not seen as playing on the same field as some of those other languages. And it's not because the language itself is inferior. It's because the community, you know, hasn't necessarily developed products on it for the public to use, you know, on a widespread basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there are plenty of CMSs for ColdFusion, but none of them has taken off the way WordPress or .NET Nuke have taken off. And I'm not sure there's really a real popular CMS for Java. Not that I'm aware of. Maybe.
Yeah, I think there's also Joomla, but I think that's a .NET one as well. I'm not really familiar with that as much, but that's another
popular one, yeah, and Drupal as well, which is a PHP one.
Yeah.
So cool. So maybe we should talk a bit about objects a bit more. You mentioned that earlier, but how does object reuse appear? You know, compare between these different languages?
So yeah, I mean, if you want ColdFusion to be fully object oriented, you can, you know, easily do that, and you know, that's very cool. One of the things that I have been loving about ColdFusion for the past few years. So on our sites, we have our desktop version, and then we have a dedicated mobile version. We decided a few years back that we were not going to go the responsive design route. So we have a dedicated mobile version with a dedicated mobile code base. But because our objects that we use are common across the two sites, we only actually have to make updates in one set of objects. So essentially, the mobile code base is really just a GUI code base. All it does is manage kind of the user interface. But for the heavy lifting, essentially the middleware, within ColdFusion Administrator, we set up a mapping, and when we want to include, an object on the mobile site, we know that we're using the same object that we're using on the desktop site. And in fact, we went so far as to do the same thing with the web service for our mobile application. So one of the primary uses on our job sites, on our sites, is searching for jobs. So we have one function that does a job search for anything that you do on the front end. And there's multiple paths into that. So you can do a straight up job search. We also have pages that are custom written to include jobs on them, where we define what the criteria would be on that. You can do it from desktop, you can do it from mobile, you can do your job search from the mobile app, and they all go through the same function. So they all return the exact same results. And if we want to make a change in that logic, we only have to make the change in one single function. When there's a couple dozen paths that go into that function, it's great to be able to have that kind of cascading functionality. And if ColdFusion didn't make it so easy to be able to reuse those objects, and then reuse those objects not only within the same code base itself, but then refer to that object from a different code base. That's, for me, that was a game changer. When I kind of, stumbled upon that functionality, I was like, because before that, we would keep the same set of objects, but we'd have to maintain it in multiple code bases. Once I came to the realization that I was making it so much harder on myself, and that we could use the same, the same set of objects for everything, and only maintain it in one place, that made development and maintenance an even easier task at that point. So yeah, as far as the reusability goes, it fully supports what the basic and a lot of the advanced concepts that you need from the development tools per se. I love being able to extend objects, getting in the inheritance and doing a lot of that. It was beginning in ColdFusion, before we had that object-oriented approach, I was still doing stuff at that time in CF5, and we had custom tags, and it's like they were trying to go that route, but it wasn't easy to do. Once they really kind of opened up that object-oriented approach with CFCs, they've been making a lot of good headway in that, and that's one of the things. One of the strong cases for Adobe is really listening to what the developer community wants, or at least has kind of their finger on the pulse of what the needs are from the developers, insofar as what do they need to make their jobs easier, what do they need to do to make ColdFusion a better friend to the developers, actually.
So how does that compare to doing object-oriented coding in other languages like PHP or .NET or Java?
So I've never even attempted to try and do anything object-oriented in PHP, simply because I've never been presented with that opportunity. But also you almost have to force object-oriented on PHP. It wasn't necessarily specifically designed with that in mind, as opposed to, say Java or .NET was specifically designed with that object-oriented type approach in mind. Don't get me wrong, the object-oriented approach, when that was applied to the language from the get-go, like it was with Java and .NET, it's great functionality that's built in, but you have to do it their way. It has to be done very specifically. The best developers that I've ever met, that I've ever, had the pleasure of working with, are developers, but they're creative people. Most of them are musicians. I'm a musician myself. And so we tend to think in a different way. And it's a very creative type of thinking, non-linear, out of the box type of thinking. ColdFusion allows you to be non-linear. If you try and be non-linear within .NET or Java, it just doesn't. They don't allow for that type of creativity. They don't allow for that flexibility, on the development side. If you're really if you love coding but you don't want to do it somebody else's way, what's the best way to do it for you. What's the best way to do it for your project. ColdFusion's going to let you do that. Microsoft and Java, they have a tendency to say, no, this is the way that you need to do it. That's why, I think that's a strong reason why that's what gets taught in universities, is because you have to learn, the way to do it, right? As opposed to, we kind of talked with ColdFusion earlier. It's not that you have to learn to do it the ColdFusion way. You just have to figure out what's the syntax to achieve this task that ColdFusion uses. And I think that's really the big difference between the two.
So it's almost like you're saying there that one of the reasons ColdFusion doesn't get taught in schools and universities is it's not complicated enough.
Yeah. I think it probably, I think it really doesn't turn out good developers. It turns out English majors, people who learned how to write in the syntax, but it doesn't turn out good developers. For me, a good developer is somebody who can solve not only the problem that they're working on, but then solve some other problems along with it and make sure that everything is taken care of from a scalability and future perspective, and see problems that might be happening in the future. And I think that's a big problem with the universities, is they're turning out people who know how to write code within a syntax, but you give them a simple logic problem and they're lost. They have no idea what to do. I think if they use ColdFusion to show how development works in universities, they could actually turn out developers rather than a person who knows how to write .NET code, which is very strict, or a person who knows how to write Java code. Very different things in my mind.
And if anyone here is at a high school or a university, just to let you know, Adobe has a whole curriculum for learning ColdFusion that you can get for free. Just email Kish or Adobe, and I'll stick his email down here and he can redirect the request. But and also the licenses for ColdFusion at universities and high schools, if you're using it for learning, are free as well. So assuming you're using Adobe ColdFusion, obviously if you're using the open source Lucy, they're free too. So I don't think there's any reason not to be teaching this stuff if you've got the desire to do it. So why don't we move on to something that I know people spend a lot of time on in other languages, which is third-party add-ons.
Mm-hmm.
How does that compare with ColdFusion?
Well, so you've got add-ons, you've also got other services that you can integrate with, and we do a little bit of both. So as far as the add-ons, we've used a couple. We use sometimes when we have issues with connecting to a third-party service over HTTP, we use the CFX HTTP5 tag. Really super simple. It's a C++ application, essentially, that we can integrate into our ColdFusion apps. Makes it super simple to work around certain security SSL authentication issues that happen from time to time. Not necessarily a ColdFusion problem, sometimes a Java problem, but it's nice to be able to use that as an alternative. And then, kind of integrating with other third-party services. We use a service called Postmark to deliver a lot of our business critical email. Again, we wrote a component to integrate with Postmark. Super simple to use, very easy to integrate with the APIs. As a job board, we work with external vendors as well to import jobs. They provide an API. We write our services in ColdFusion to import that data. It's actually really super simple and quick to be able to use and do. We use Twilio to send out text messages. Again, another super simple, easy integration for us that we could set up as far as third-party integrations. When it comes to actual add-ons, one of the great things for ColdFusion is that we use kind of extensively in resume submission and invoice creation and things of that nature is the PDF functionality, which is built in right from the get-go on ColdFusion. In fact, we had one part of our website was written in .NET, but 95% of it is written in ColdFusion. We just have this one particular feature. One of the requirements that one of our sites had was that they wanted to, for brand recognition, watermark resumes that were sent on to employers and recruiters. To do that in ColdFusion, it was really simple. We were able to convert our files into a PDF format, add that watermark, and then send the PDF off to the client. Really super simple, easy integration to do. If you want to do that in .NET, you got to fork over money. So we didn't want to fork over money. We actually wrote a ColdFusion service to add that watermark onto the file and send it off to the client. That was great. The PDF generation, I mean, if you can go as easy or as complex as you need to go. If you just want to write an HTML page, you can just write an HTML page, save it as a PDF, and download it right to the client. I mean, that's great. That's easy. That's simple. You can add formatting. You could add watermarks. We haven't used some of the other advanced integrations of PDF, but there's a lot more advanced things that you can actually do with PDF generation that's built right into Java itself. And if you're working, your business has to send documentation to clients. You have to pretty much use PDFs because that's the universal format. That just is what makes the most sense. You can do signing with PDFs. You can do all that functionality, and it's built right in from ColdFusion, which is just that in itself is kind of amazing. That if you want to do anything with PDFs in any other language than ColdFusion, it's a pain in the butt. It's very difficult to get through all the configuration and everything else you have to do before you can even start writing code to work with PDFs. Whereas if you want to do a PDF in ColdFusion, just open up your IDE and start writing the code for it. So when it comes to third parties and PDF stuff, if you have to do anything with PDF, there shouldn't be any other consideration other than just use ColdFusion right up front, because it's built in from the ground from day one. There's nothing else you need to do. I can't think of anything that you need to do in a PDF in ColdFusion that you'd have to buy, or install another add-on. So.
Yeah, and that's true of a lot of different areas where you have to use an add-on to get something done in other languages or a library. So, and of course, one of the issues with with libraries is sometimes the different libraries don't get on with each other. So at least if they're built into the language and have been tested together, it all kind of work friendly together.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing. So it sounds overall, you think on all these aspects, ColdFusion comes out ahead. So is there anywhere that ColdFusion lags behind any of those other three languages, or?
From a technical standpoint, I don't really think that there's anything that ColdFusion lags behind. I think it's just a perception and marketing, where it seems to lag behind. ColdFusion, I know, is widely used, especially in government agencies. A lot of the job postings that you'll see are government jobs that require security clearance. And that they're going to want to use something. They're going to want to use something that's secure, that is going to be easy to develop in. But it doesn't. When people talk about what runs the web, ColdFusion never really comes up. It just doesn't seem that it's marketed to. It's not marketed as a strong competing driving product on the web. It's just people within the ColdFusion community truly love ColdFusion, and that would always be their choice to develop in. And it just doesn't seem to be that, I don't necessarily see other people having that fervent dedication to whatever language they may be developing in. I know guys who develop in multiple languages, and they'll do whatever, the client requests, and it doesn't really matter to them. But I think, when somebody works in ColdFusion, they're always going to want to recommend ColdFusion. So.
Yeah, certainly a very passionate community, from what I've seen at the last CF Summit or CF United or any of the other conferences around the world. They're now all over the place. They just had the CF Summit India, there was CF Camp in Germany. So, and of course, we've got Into the Box in Houston, Texas, and CF Summit East in DC. So lots of conferences and excitement. So I think we should just briefly discuss security, because a lot of people accuse ColdFusion of being insecure. But I read a recent CNET survey that actually ColdFusion came out way ahead of PHP and Java and .NET for security holes that had been found, and even day zero incidents. So I'm curious of your thoughts on ColdFusion and security.
Yeah. So when it comes to security, one of the issues you have to take into consideration is some security exploits aren't necessarily because of the language itself, but because of what the developer did. If you develop secure code, then that doesn't come into factor. But as far as the actual security exploits, I believe it's been years since there was a zero-day exploit in ColdFusion. I can't remember how long, but I think it's been maybe,
it's 5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. So I mean that's been a long time. I know that ColdFusion is very reactive in getting those updates out when anything is actually discovered. It's especially now, it's super easy to update your ColdFusion instance with the latest fixes and security updates. It's just a matter of going into the administrator and essentially installing it. You don't have to do anything special or fancy to get in there and do that. I have noticed that Microsoft still gets their regular updates. They still have a lot that's going on. I can see the benefit of the on the Windows side. Let's talk about that specifically. Those can be scheduled and automatically done, and that makes it usually pretty easy to stay on top of that. I think you can do that with ColdFusion as well, but I prefer to have a little bit more control over mine so that, I know the time of day that it's going to happen, and I can react to anything that, may happen from that. We have had instances where Windows updates have been installed, and for some reason or another, it caused our site to stop responding. So we had to, go back and figure out, what change that did. But as far as the security of ColdFusion itself, if you're staying on top of those updates, then yeah, right there, you're finding yourself well covered. And if you're developing good code, just by following best practices, we talk about SQL injection. If you're just following best practices, your site will never be vulnerable to SQL injection if you use CF query params. That the problem is, if you don't do that, then yeah, you'll be vulnerable just like anybody else would. But if you follow the best practice of using CF query params, you're getting the benefit on multiple levels, because not only are you getting the benefit from a security standpoint, where you're preventing your site from being hacked with SQL injection, but the database performance boost that you get from using CF query params, because it allows SQL Server to cache all of those query plans. That was one of the big takeaways I got from the last CF Summit, was actually, if you hard code in, let's say you have a database with 10 records, and you have 10 ID values. If you hard code in into your SQL statement the 10 ID values, that's 10 query plans. But if you use SQL query param, that's one query plan, because it actually uses params instead of building a plan for each individual statement. So, I mean, just use the best practices in ColdFusion, and you'll have a very secure platform.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What about some of these other languages? Do you know anything about security on them?
I don't really know too much, other than, things get hacked all the time. We had a WordPress site for one of our divisions that got hacked pretty easily, because it didn't get updated. Nobody was maintaining that site, essentially, and somebody was able to get in and mess with the content and kind of mess up the database. But again, it was built on PHP. It was a easy exploit to get in and find and execute against the website. But if you have to keep on top of the updates, and that's going to be the same across any platform. But not to, I tend not to like to use this example, but it's, people are going to go after what are the most popular languages on the internet, right? So yeah, it makes sense that .NET and PHP are going to be huge, nightlights for the people to be attracted to figure out where they want to find their exploits. And ColdFusion is going to have that same amount of draw, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to get to ColdFusion eventually. So I truly believe that ColdFusion has less security exploits, but it's not because it is not as prevalent on the internet. It's simply because it's harder to find those exploits. It's the same reason why it's easier to hack an Android phone than it is an Apple phone. Yeah, most of the stuff with Apple is proprietary, but they do a good job of keeping on top of finding security breaches and sending out regular updates and getting that stuff fixed. ColdFusion, Adobe seems to follow the similar process of making sure that they take security concerns very seriously, and want to make sure that they're not just reactive but proactive, and not building in, or thoroughly testing functionality as they create it to make sure that it will be secure and not provide additional exploits for malicious hackers to get in and use against you.
Yeah, I think keeping your server up to date and writing more secure code works whatever language you're in. But certainly, as far as the number of holes that have been reported, ColdFusion is definitely ahead of the other languages on that. So I think that brings us to the final topic here, that the L word for legacy, which is something that ColdFusion seems to get accused of. But I kind of looked up how old PHP, Java, and .NET are, and they seem to be about the same age. How come they don't get called legacy? Well, maybe they do, and I just haven't heard it.
That's a really good question. I don't, maybe because some of the old ColdFusion apps that were developed are still running in those old versions because they're just fine. I don't know. But so Microsoft made the whole switch from classic ASP to .NET, which was a definitive switch. I mean, when you're looking at timeline of web development for Microsoft, that's a big red line. There's no commonality. It was such a huge shift. ColdFusion is legacy, but only in the fact that they've gone out of their way to make sure that things are backwards compatible. So if you're currently developing in CF5 or 6 or 7, and you need, your company all of a sudden decides they want to invest in infrastructure and update to CF18, it's going to be a bit of a project, but it's not going to be a complete code rewrite, right? They've gone out of their way to make sure that each version is compatible with the previous version, and they've, instead of reinventing their entire development platform, they've built upon it and improved upon it. Whereas other languages don't necessarily do that. I think PHP is a bit of an exception, but PHP is purely open source and doesn't have necessarily a market-driven public entity that is has a bottom line per se. But ColdFusion is only legacy in the fact that they didn't want to leave anybody behind, which I think is a favor really to the development community, and that they're not trying to reinvent their entire platform every few years just to make themselves appear relevant, really.
Right. We've seen that recently in the WordPress world where they rolled out that, whatever that update was called, passing my brain, but they just totally changed how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Which caused a lot of people to get upset.
Yeah.
So let's close with some questions I ask all my guests, which the first one is, why are you proud to use ColdFusion?
I'm proud to use ColdFusion because it allows me to be me, from a development perspective. It allows me to have my own style versus somebody else's predetermined style, which allows me to have more pride in the work that I actually do. I feel more connected to it. I feel more ownership of it. And I take more pride in the tasks that I work on, the features that I develop and my team develops. So that's the big thing, is it allows me to use my best judgment instead of somebody else's best judgment.
And coming back to this theme of legacy and ColdFusion sometimes being accused of dying, I like to flip that on its head. What would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year, in your opinion?
If we could get some publicity from some of the major organizations that are using ColdFusion, that might inspire some people, especially as if it's something that's coming up in the news. I know NASA uses ColdFusion, so why aren't they making a big deal out of that? ColdFusion is going to help us get to Mars. That's a great subject line for an article or something like that. But I think if we just had public recognition of large organizations that are using ColdFusion on a daily basis as part of their mission critical apps. I think that right there would help silence a lot of the critics of ColdFusion as legacy or dying or whatever they may want to say.
Maybe farms.com is going to say great things about ColdFusion.
Maybe I'd like to be able to get them to do that.
Well, at least we're doing this podcast episode.
That's right.
So what did you enjoy at CF Summit this year? I know you were there. So.
We had a great time. I went there with my 2 team leads. Every year, I come away with at least 1 or 2 very significant takeaways from the event that immediately go into our development strategy and architecture. I can't say enough about that, how important it is just to get out there and see what other people are doing. There's, I guess, 6 events in each day, so maybe you attend 12 events. To be able to go to 12 events, a lot of which don't necessarily apply to what it is I'm working on, but at least I'm seeing what other people are doing. But to be able to come back and within the next week say, this is what we're doing now. We need to start working and getting this. And then all of a sudden, we see projects coming up related specifically to those takeaways from that event. I mean, that's hugely important. Can't express that, anymore. My development leads are the same way. They come back with strong takeaways of things that they want to implement. But, to have something, go to a ColdFusion seminar or ColdFusion event, and then come away immediately with something that you're going to start implementing the next week or the next day or the next month. That's happened consistently for the past several years for me. And so, that's one of the things that I enjoy the most, and getting to sit and talk and socialize and network with other, developers in ColdFusion and see what other people are doing. That's great as well. I thoroughly enjoy that.
Yeah, I definitely recommend anyone listening, if you're able to get to the CF Summit, West or East, or the one in India, or to any of the other ColdFusion conferences like CF Camp or Into the Box, or Muracon, or NC DevCon. They're all great places to learn new stuff and mix with other developers. So if folks want to find you online, what are the best ways to do that?
Probably via LinkedIn. I tend to use social media as more of a social thing, and not as much professional. But yeah, I'd definitely be on LinkedIn. I think my LinkedIn profile is, I gotta bring it up real quick. I think it's Brian.Cain.
Yeah. Well, we'll put it in the show notes, so
yeah,
have it exactly, which you can find at terratech.com. And yeah, it's been great talking to you, Brian, and I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.